There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between radio and bar talk, between commentary and recaps, and it lies between the pit of man's Netflix subscriptions and the summit of his binge-watching ability. This is the dimension of podcasting and the Twilight Zone. These are the Zone-i-Sodes. And now your hosts, Brandon Davis and Scott McFarland.
And hello to all of you out there in podcast world. This is the Front Row Movie Reviews. I'm your host, Brandon Davis. I host classics. And this is episode 4 of our Zone-i-Sodes, talking about episode 3 of the Twilight Zone. And
I think what we need to do is just say that your intro episode was episode 0.
0.
That way we
okay.
don't confuse people.
All right. So this is episode 3.
There you go.
This is episode 3. There we go. Of the Twilight Zone-i-Sodes. And here on this long trek with me is...
You make it sound like it's a Baton Death March or something. Hi, I'm Scott. I do flashbacks. If you like 80s and 90s schlock, I'm your dude.
It's... you know what? It seems long, but I have a feeling once we get season 1 out of the way, it's still going to be a breeze.
Until we hit season 4 with the hour-long episodes. I do realize I say I'm an 80s and 90s guy as I'm wearing a 90s ska t-shirt. I fit the role well.
Oh man, yeah, but we won't get to the hour-long episodes for at least another decade.
So far, we have released every Friday, so we are doing better than I thought.
Yes, we are. So let's keep going as much as we can. So we're here to talk about episode 3, which is Mr. Denton on Doomsday, which aired October 16th, 1959 on CBS, and an interesting episode. The first time Rod Serling treks back to the Old West won't be the last. We will see other times he ventures into the Old West. Some, in my opinion, maybe a little more effective than this one, not to spoil anything that we'll be talking about. Anyway, but an episode filled with strong performances, though, in my opinion. Scott, before I give the opening narration from Rod, what are your initial impressions, though, of Mr. Denton on Doomsday?
I do want to point out it's amazing that they go back to Westerns a lot when there's Western sets all over Hollywood at this time.
Oh, yeah.
Is somebody trying to save on the budget?
Well, the Western was big money at that time. So had...
it's easy to go get costumes.
This was the golden age of what? You had Gunsmoke, you had Bonanza, you had Rawhide, Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel. I think the Virginian was on at that time, the Rifleman, so a lot of different Westerns.
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett.
Frontier.
Yeah, although Disney was a different universe at that time.
Hi. Craig will get upset with you.
I know. I didn't say it was I didn't say what kind of universe it was, though. So it was just...
Well, you want me to do a little synopsis for the folks?
Yeah, give them a synopsis first.
Sure.
First impressions.
Al Denton used to be a quick draw. In fact, he was probably one of the quickest ones in the West, especially for the town that he is in. But because, as we find out later, after he shot a young man and killed him, his guilt has taken over, and he no longer is a shootist, and in fact, he's more of the town drunk. And we find Mr. Denton being bullied by a very young and odd-looking Martin Landau. But Mr. Denton is met by Mr. Fate, because, again, we can't name these guys any more than Mr. Death and Mr. Fate at this point. Henry J. Fate, to be exact. And Mr. Fate gives Al the ability to stand up for himself, and immediately people from around the area come to test his wherewithal again. And Mr. Fate gives him an elixir that will help him to aim and shoot true for a few seconds. And we find that Mr. Denton and the person going after him decide to shoot each other in the hands for an odd reason I'm sure we'll talk about. And at the end of our episode, Al Denton has found himself and been able to find himself outside of having to be the guy that everyone looks to as a gunslinger.
Yeah, and here I will. I'll start here too with Rod's opening monologue here, and actually it's a little longer than the last two that we've had. But portrait of a town drunk named Al Denton. This is a man who's begun his dying early. A long, agonizing route through a maze of bottles. Al Denton, who would probably give an arm or a leg or a part of his soul to have another chance, to be able to rise up and shake the dirt from his body and the bad dreams that infest his consciousness. In the parlance of the times, this is a peddler, a rather fanciful-looking man in a black frock coat. And this is the third principal character of our story, showing a revolver on the ground. Its function, perhaps to give Mr. Al Denton his second chance. And, we mentioned before, it was inevitable that Rod Serling would go back to the Old West at some point because, in the late 50s, ever since all the way back to the 40s and through the 70s, the way to get to the American people's hearts, the mainstream was to tell a story about the Old West. And just a quick plug, sometime around the time this episode drops, our classics episode of The Searchers will probably be dropping, which Scott joined me on. Of course, we're still, even though we don't get as many Westerns as we used to, we're still fascinated by the Old West even today, I think. Scott, what are your first, though, impressions of this episode?
This is one of those, we mentioned One for the Angels last week as one of those that gets played a lot on TV. This one I don't see much. And in fact, I don't remember the first time that I saw this. The thing that really stands out to me in this episode is, for one, having Martin Landau show up. I know he isn't the main cusp of this episode, but you can't look at that man's face and not be caught by it as soon as he shows up on screen. So that was one of the first things that I caught. In terms of everything else, I'm actually a fan of Westerns, and I think I'll get myself in trouble when people start hearing the Searchers podcast because, spoilers, I don't think the Searchers is as good as everyone else thinks it is. But I do love Westerns, and I think that
he doesn't hate it, though.
No, I don't hate it, no. I hate other things that we review, but not that. But really, I think this episode is a nice moral story, and I can't really give too much in first impressions because I don't honestly remember the first time I saw this thing. So I kind of came into this one cold, even though I'm sure I've watched it before.
Well, and like you said, this is one that doesn't show up in the marathons much. So I did not remember this episode when I watched it. So I probably watched it for the first time, a few weeks ago when we started this whole venture. And I like I said before, the story itself, I think the performances in this episode are stronger than the story. I really like Dan Duryea, who plays Al Denton, mainly because I think he's really effective in both versions of Al Denton. I think that he's effective as the drunk, and then I think he's effective as sort of the reformed Al Denton toward the end. And he plays that character really well, and he doesn't play sort of from the Old West like you see in some of these John Wayne Westerns of the time. And there is sort of this sophistication to his character. There are some things in this episode that, knock you over the head, especially with the Mr. Fate character. But, there is an interesting moral tale that Serling is getting to here. But, I think along with last week's episode, One for the Angels, I think this script is a little subpar, but the performances sort of enhance the episode.
Yeah, and I think for me, I agree with everything you just said, and I think, and I keep I keep jumping ahead to the punchline, but I think this episode's a little better for me than the last one because I think the story, not so much the script, I agree with you there, but the story is a little more interesting than the story
Okay.
we got last week. And part of that for me is, as you already mentioned, the fact that we have a character that not only gets developed very quickly and we kind of understand the character as soon as we see him get tossed out of the bar, but the fact that he's able to take the turn, and I do think that the fact that he's able to play both of these parts is really interesting and really well done, and that's why one of my favorite scenes in this is the first time we see Al when he's cleaned up. He's clean shaven. He just got a shower, and he immediately starts talking about the fact that they're all going to start gunning for me again. He realizes, even though that he's gotten himself out of the bottle, that there's another fate that after him that's going to be just as bad as the alcoholism. And then we also get his explanation of why he turned to the bottle, and the fact that everyone was gunning for him to try to have their shot at the fastest gun, and he takes out a kid. And they don't. I mean, the Twilight Zone is never a violent show because in the 50s and 60s, how violent can you truly be on TV? But they don't bury the lead at all. I mean, he basically says the kid got shot in the gut and he bled out, and I watched him bleed out. That's pretty hardcore, even for now, let alone a show from 60 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and with Serling, what hits you in a Serling script, it's never the act itself; it's the ramifications from the act.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, just somebody bleeding out, as gory as that could be, that's not what necessarily affects you. It's the aftermath and all the stuff that plays in your head, like it does with Denton. And I just, like I said, Duryea was a very interesting, mainly a stage actor at the time, but as we'll beat this horse to death here, but Serling was a master of casting. And, he cast someone very unlikely at the time that you would see in a Western type role, but he does it very well. I think this cast is very strict. We see a young Martin Landau who, just as crazy looking then as he is,
I don't think he aged in 60 years. I really don't. He got a little grayer and a little wrinkler, but he's still got that. He's still got that mouth of his.
And 59 was, Jeremy and Allison and I a few months ago talked about, one of his first big film roles, which came out this same year in 59 in Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And so he was just starting to make tracks at this time. And just, I don't think there's ever been an actor that quite looks like, especially when he gets those eyes going. It's
And see, this is why you do classics and I do flashback, because when I think Martin Landau, I don't think North by Northwest.
Yeah.
I think his cameo in X-Files Fight the Future from the 90s. He shows up at a bar and says, "Mulder, you're going in the wrong direction," and that's about it.
Gosh. Oh, I do recommend, he did win the Oscar. I do recommend his performance as Bela Lugosi and Ed Wood. He is good in that.
Yeah, see, I've never actually watched Ed Wood, and it's not a fact that I don't think it would be an interesting movie. It's I cannot, for the life of me, stand Tim Burton, and therefore I just there are only really two Tim Burton movies I can watch without wanting to kill the man and bury the body somewhere, and it ain't Martin Landau isn't in Beetlejuice or Batman, so that's where we're at.
This is early Burton, so he's not quite over the top yet. I mean, Burton was always over the top. I mean, the first movie he did was Pee-wee's Big Adventure. But
okay, time out. Now I'm gonna have to say there are 3 Tim Burton movies that I'll watch.
Please, can we talk about Pee-wee's Big Adventure on Flashback?
Dude, as long as we can talk about Big Top Pee-wee too, because like many things, I watched the sequel of that one more than I watched the original. And Chris Christopherson as the ringmaster of a circus, talking to Pee Wee Herman, it's an interesting experience.
Oh man. Oh gee, yeah, but Martin Landau, though, appropriately, as we mentioned before, with Edwin hamming it up appropriately in this episode, the intensity that he gives you in that first scene.
He
It's just
wants to be the big
magic.
bad in his black hat and
Yeah.
his over the top.
Yeah.
But there's also a little bit of a sense of Schadenfreude in here that I enjoy too, because I'm a big fan of watching bullies get their ass beat as much as humanly
Yeah.
possible. So the fact
Mhm.
that Landau gets his character Don Hodling gets his ass beat about halfway through the episode, and then we don't really see him anymore. I enjoy that.
Not really.
I enjoy the fact that who you thought
Yeah.
was the antagonist really was just a bully who needed to get pushed out of the way, and I appreciate
Uh,
that.
Another performance that I appreciate in this episode is Jean Cooper, who plays Liz Smith. I think she
Yeah.
doesn't play your typical, dance hall, girl that you would see in westerns like this. She has a maturity about her.
Absolutely.
That's really really good. And I always try and make connections for different actors or whatever. If you grew up with a grandmother or mother who watched soap operas, Jean Cooper played Catherine Chancellor on The Young and the Restless for like 40 years or something like that. So I grew up with a grandma who watched The Young and the Restless, so I knew who Jean Cooper was. And
I love the fact that you say you grew up with a grandma. My wife still watches Days of Our Lives religiously. So this stuff is not ended.
there were people in college who were addicted to soap still, I remember. So.
My DVR has about 30 episodes of Days of Our Lives because she's that far behind. It's insane. I know more about the Days of Our Lives plot lines than I really, really should. They're not good.
Oh man, well, and then also I also liked Malcolm Atterbury did what he had to do as fate. He has a very sort of imposing presence.
Yeah, it's also interesting too, and this is kind of meta just because we know the episodes now, but it's interesting that we have 2 episodes in a row with a salesman. First we had Lou doing his pitches on the street corner, and now we've got the snake oil salesman in Dr. Fate. So, well, Dr. Fate's a DC character, but Henry J. Fate. And as much as we complained about the last scene in One for the Angels and how Lou didn't really do a really good sales pitch at the end, even though it's one of the best supposedly. This snake oil salesman this scene really does drag for me.
Yeah.
And it's the actors are doing okay, but it's like, how many minutes can we spend talking about a thimble full of drink? Because we spend several minutes talking about a thimble full of drink.
Yeah, that's true. I do like, even though it's a little convoluted, the scene between Grant and Denton where they do end up, shooting each other in the hands, even though it is a convoluted plot point, it still works, I think, and emotionally maybe, not logically, but it serves Serling's point.
Well, and I think the nice thing about it is it's a little ham-fisted when it does it, but it points out there's always a third option. Because throughout this episode, we're being told there are 2 options for Al. There is go in the bottle and be somebody that no one cares about, or be the best at what you do and make everyone want to care about you in a negative way.
Yeah.
But there's a third option, and the third option is giving up your skill without giving up your life. Yeah. And I think it could have been said a little better, but it's a good moral tale, and it's a good way to close it out by saying that you don't have to take door number 1 and door number 2. You can find another way to get through.
Yeah, or even, sort of, better to have a little damage done to yourself and learn a lesson early than a lot of damage done over the course of years and learning that lesson late. Which
when you have some lead in your gut. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other part of this episode that either works or not works for you?
No, I think it's hard. It's interesting. Time is always relative.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some 20 some odd minute episodes that seem like they go on for a long time. And there are some 20-minute episodes that seem like they fly by really quickly. This, for me, is one of those episodes that seems to go by really quickly. There's about 2 or 3 set pieces. There's about 3 or 4 scenes, and we're out the door, which is almost the exact opposite of what we'll have next week with 16 millimeter Shrine. So with this, there's not much that I can hit on just because there's only about 5 scenes. You've got the original scene where we meet Al as a drunk. We have Al pushing around Dan. We have Al talking with Liz. We have Al talking with Fate. And we have Al in the bar. And that's really the entire episode. So I really like the episode of Al and the scene of Al and Liz talking. I really didn't think the scene with Al and Fate worked for me. And that's about half the episode.
Yeah, you mentioned, even though next week, when you think about Shrine, it takes place mainly in 2 locations, but you feel like there's a lot more meat to it. And we'll get into that next week when we talk about that episode. But yeah, this is a simple story told simply. It gets across what Serling wants to, and yet still for me, I guess sort of now as we transition into our rankings here, still feels a bit underwhelming for me. You want to go into, in case someone's just joining us, how we're going to rank these episodes?
In case you're joining us in the year 2020 and we're almost done with this thing, we rank our episodes based on a comparison with other Twilight Zone episodes because I think Brandon and I both would theorize that even a mediocre Twilight Zone episode is going to be better than many of other TV episodes you're going to see across the spectrum. So what we do is we have a ranking of 1 through 10. 1 is a pretty mediocre, subpar Twilight Zone episode. 10 is one of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes of all time. And 5 is an average episode of the Twilight Zone that you would catch week to week. So on that, I believe I'll go first, and I'm going to give this episode a 5. I think this is our average episode. I think there is some really good points. I think there is some really good acting. The cusp of the story has a good message, but it does lack in a lot of the script. It lacks a lot in the pacing of it. And it really could have done a better job of getting us to the end answer to the story than what they did.
Yeah, I think you and I are kind of inverse this week compared to what we were last week. I'm going to give this episode a 4
okay.
Because I felt One for the Angels last week was a subpar script, but was turned into an average episode because of Edwin's performance. And for me personally, One for the Angels sticks with me in my memory more than this one does. For me, this episode's fine and I like it, but it doesn't quite. I remember certain things just a whole lot easier from One for the Angels, and some of those scenes stay with me in my mind. So, so far, the gold standard for me is Where Is Everybody, which I gave a 7, and then I consider One for the Angels average at 5, and this one's just a little bit below it at 4. But once again, you and I aren't far off from one another.
No, but you make very good points, and I think the Sci-Fi Channel would agree with you. That's why they air One for the Angels, and they never air Mr. Denton on Doomsday, from what I can tell. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. But I tell you what, I am excited, though, because we've got a couple of very strong episodes coming down the road here, especially within the next, 3-4 weeks coming up. Some really, really interesting stuff to talk about. So we've kind of we're still in the introductory phase of Twilight Zone. We're still having Serling getting his bearings, but he's going to do some experimenting here in the next few weeks with a whole lot of different types of storytelling, and it's going to be interesting to watch and talk about.
I don't know what you're talking about, Brandon. We're not introductory anymore. We're 2% through this series. We are 1.9% through this series.
Well, no, well, I guess I meant introductory in terms of we're still sort of finding, what the real voice of Twilight Zone will be, which Serling will find later in this season and the early part of the second season.
I would hypothesize that Serling finds the true voice of Twilight Zone when he finds the camera and starts looking at it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can't wait to start talking about just some of his intros and everything. That'll be a lot of fun. Well, before we close out here, let me give you Rod's closing narration to this episode. Mr. Henry Fate, dealer in utensils and pots and pans, liniments and potions, a fanciful little man in a black frock coat who can help a man climbing out of a pit or another man from falling into one. Because you see, fate can work that way in the Twilight Zone. And we still got Rod sort of explaining to us what you can find in the Twilight Zone.
But he is getting much shorter in his closings. Yeah. He's no longer telling us the entire plot. So he's getting there. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Anyway, we thank you all, though, for joining us here for episode 3 of Zone-i-Sodes. And you can hear all of our other Zone-i-Sode episodes, as long as all of our other content, classics or flashbacks, at our website, the frontrowmoviereviews.com. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher. You can find us at Twitter at the Front Row Movie Reviews with a Z. Anything else I'm missing?
You can email us at the frontrowmoviereviews or at gmail.com. And if you're checking us
on Facebook.
Yes, Facebook, Instagram. We're on all your social media pleasurable areas. Ooh, that didn't sound right at all. And if you're catching us on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe. We want to have more people checking us out and finding out if we are. We want to hear from you on this. And to do that, we need to elevate ourselves in the YouTube searches. So please like and subscribe. Even if you hate our guts, help us out. It's okay. We're only going to show up in your feed every Friday. You can just delete us. It's okay.
That's true. I hope you don't delete us, though.
Did I mention I used to sell vacuum cleaners door to door?
Because I promise you we'll get better as we go. But hopefully, it'll be fun. Hopefully we've either some of our front row colleagues or other people who are fans of the show, we can get to join us every once in a while, so they just don't have to hear the two of us talk all the time.
Oh, I don't know. Your docile tones are wonderful.
Well, yeah, but too much of a good thing sometimes.
Well played, sir. Well played.
No, on what?
No, I had a person on Facebook who actually is a friend of mine from Boy Scout camp back in the day, Andy. So hopefully he's listening or watching. But Andy messaged me and said, "Thank you for doing this show." So we'll definitely have to get Andy on at least to talk about one of his favorite episodes. It may be 3 or 4 years down the road, I don't know, but we'll definitely get him on. There'll be some other people too. So that's another thing too. If you have some episodes that you're looking forward to, let us know. Let us know what you're looking forward to. Give us your ideas and your thoughts on them, and we'll integrate those into the show as well.
Absolutely. And for now, until we see you in the 16mm shrine, I am Brandon Davis.
And I'm Scott McFarland.
And we will see you on the couch.
We sound like psychiatrists.
We'll have to do Frasier for our next.
Oh, God. How many seasons was that?
11.
And on that note, goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Zone-i-Sodes is a special presentation of the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast. For more information, go to www.thefrontrowmoviereviews.com.